Welcome to season 4 of the Leader's Way podcast. This is so exciting, an auspicious moment.
It is.
And
Glad to be here.
I'm so honored to be in the presence of wonderful students, Misty and Whitney, who hopefully listeners have met. Go back and listen to the episode in which we share your presence with us. Two radiant humans, brilliant students, deeply holy humans.
Oh my,
And
that's very kind.
two Tennesseans. Oh, what's the word? Is that it? Tennesseans?
Yeah,
Tennesseans.
I got nervous halfway through. It's
No,
such
that
a
was
long
good.
word. I
All
fell off
those
a
E's
cliff
and
in the middle.
S's.
So we're beginning a semester here. We're beginning a season of podcasting. We're all coming back to town. Tell the people, because the people want to know, what did you do on your summer vacations?
Oh my. Well, first I had to move to New Haven. So that was a whole job.
You hadn't been living here in the
I
Elm
hadn't
City.
been. Yeah. So we did that move, which was very exciting. And then I've been doing CPE. So that is clinical pastoral education. And I worked at the VA as a chaplain for the summer, which felt like I had so much to learn and it was such good work to be doing. And I heard such amazing stories from people and it was really a really great experience.
At the bedside, people
Yeah.
sick, broken arms,
Yes.
people dying, like everything.
Passing away.
All the things.
Yeah, I miss a lot of them a lot. Yeah.
Gosh.
It was a good summer.
Well, we're glad you're here and local and not
you.
flying, commuting.
too.
That's a commute, New Haven to
Monday and
Nashville.
Wednesday last year, I was going back and forth each week. So that was pretty intense. So I'm very grateful to be 10 minutes up the road now.
Yeah, well, we're thankful too. Whitney, what about you? How was your summer?
Oh, it's been a great summer. To be a Tennessean in Connecticut is just delightful. So I'm married. My husband works here in New Haven, found a job in the school system, and he decided to teach summer school this summer, and I decided to keep on working at Yale. And so he and I stayed up here, and we sent our children back home to Tennessee to be with their grandparents. And that was a really good decision. Matco and I have been married for almost 20 years now, and he's definitely one of my favorite people. But sometimes, in the thick of all the work you're doing and child raising and being a seminarian, you forget to spend time with your partner. And so Matt and I have been making up for that by taking little trips on the weekends and finding out more about the state where we're living now, Connecticut. At the very end of summer, we went to Maine, and I just kind of fell in love with Maine. And now I'm having dreams of Maine. So it's been really delightful.
Do you have any recommendations in terms of Connecticut places to explore and visit that you really liked?
Oh, well, we did the Gilmore Girls tour, which isn't technically an official tour, but the Gilmore Girls is modeled off of several small towns in Connecticut, and so we went to those small towns and sat in the gazebo and visited the coffee shops and the bookstores, and that was probably more fun for me than Matt Cohn now that I think about it. But then
He's such a good egg. He just goes along with whatever you want, Whitney. He just loves you
he's
so
a better
much.
egg than Luke
He's excellent.
from Gilmore Girls.
I mean, yeah, they've got to be real close.
okay. So that
His
was
hat
real
was on
fun.
backward all
That's
summer.
true.
Oh my gosh.
What about you, Brandon? What did you do this summer?
Well, I was in Narragansett, Rhode Island at the beach. That's an annual tradition of ours. But we just got back. I just got back from Colorado. I was at a beautiful retreat center, Cathedral Ridge, an Episcopal retreat center up in the mountains with our curates who are starting our virtual curacy program, 11 new spiritual leaders and priests, soon-to-be priests, who are just taking those very first steps in leadership.
Wow.
And to watch them support each other, ask the hard questions, both down in the weeds, but also the biggest questions that the human heart can hold. It was stunningly beautiful and so moving, at least after the altitude sickness
Oh, gosh.
ceased, which was real.
that'll-
Holy cow. Yeah, it
Holy
kicked
cow.
me,
was
You really
right.
did experience that.
kicked
That's
me
rough.
in the face. Yeah, for 24 hours. Thankfully, some people had it for longer. But the Rocky Mountains, whoa, I'd never been before.
Beautiful. Just beautiful.
Magical. I mean, so you walk out of the back door to this retreat center and you are in wilderness. and just miles and miles of trails through the Rockies. It was just amazing.
Fantastic.
So, and a full
Very
summer.
special.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. You all had more fun than me, I'm just saying. It's not really fair. So I don't know how we're going to make up for that, but anyway.
Yeah, you got to double down on next summer.
Next summer's going to be a party, let me tell you right now.
So we have such an amazing guest. When Pádraig Tuama said that he'd love to come and have a conversation about spirituality and poetry, it did feel like a dream come true for me. His voice has sort of been in my head, his words and my heart for so long, and what a luminous soul.
So today we are delighted to have with us Pádraig Tuama, a renowned poet, theologian, and conflict mediator. Pádraig is widely recognized for his profound and insightful contributions to the fields of poetry, spirituality, and peacemaking. As the former leader of the Coromila community, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organization, Pádraig has dedicated his life to fostering dialogue and understanding in divided communities. His work has brought healing and hope to many through his unique blend of poetry, storytelling, and theology. Pádraig is the author of several acclaimed books, including In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World, and Daily Prayer with the Coromila Community. His poetry and prose explore themes of belonging, identity, and the human experience, resonating deeply with readers around the world. In addition to his writing, Pádraig hosts the popular podcast Poetry Unbound, where he shares and reflects on poems that illuminate the beauty and complexity of life. His deep appreciation for the power of words and his commitment to peace shine through in every aspect of his work. We're glad to have him with us today.
Welcome to the Leader's Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We convene sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who explore the creative vision needed to lead change in our aching world. I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, lecturer at Yale Divinity School and executive director of the Office of Transforming Leaders at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. I'm so glad you're here. Pádraig, welcome to the Leader's Way podcast.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's nice to be with you.
I'm so thankful. I want to share a story about how you came into my awareness of late. I mean, your books have been around my house and in my life for a long, long time. But last summer, my children for Father's Day bought me tickets to the Hozier concert that was happening at Woodstock, and it was magical. One of the most amazing concerts. If you ever have a chance to see Hozier, it's really worth it. Wonderful Irish artist. And anyway, your name came up on stage through Alison Russell, who I think you'd worked with internationally, and the crowd erupted at the sound of your name. And I thought, isn't this fantastic? And I hope someday I could ask you about how this has come to be in your life, that you stand in the place of poet and spiritual teacher and theologian and cult hero among the folks who are gathered here at this Hozier concert. Anyway, so could you tell us a little bit of the story of how words came into your life and how words became your heart's work? I presume you might name words as your heart work and not, I don't know, auto mechanics or something like that. But can you tell us the story of how you got to do what you do?
Well, in many ways, I'm just a product of Ireland. I'm 50 this year, and when I was going to school, I just went to the ordinary local school in our village. We were learning poetry off by heart every week, one poem in English, one poem in Irish. And so at the end of every year, kind of from the age of 5 to 17, you needed to have about 70 poems off by heart in order to be able to answer them in your examinations. And I mean, we weren't being asked about our personal opinions about the poems. It was a very particularly kind of 1980s version of what did the poem mean in what did the poet mean in stanza 2, or how many similes are there being employed. But I loved poetry, and so I used to read ahead every summer and have the ones of my favourites already memorised. I'm number 3 of 6 siblings, so I would have heard my older siblings memorise some of the poems or complain about them. A curriculum like that doesn't necessarily make for a nation of poetry lovers. It just makes for a nation of people with opinions about poetry. So my youngest brother, number 6, can't stand poetry, but he can quote Sylvia Plath at length to tell you why he can't stand poetry. So in many ways, I suppose I feel like I'm part of the legacy of that. Many of the poets that we were learning in Irish language were poets who were writing about occupation and British presence in Ireland over the previous centuries. And so there was never, and I am just one of billions of people around the world for whom this is just the absolute reality. There was never an imagination that poetry wasn't concerned with public life and politics and execution and independence and land and in enforced borders or partition. So, poetry was just part of the way of looking at the world for me.
Is there a poem that, when you tell that story of memorizing poetry, that instantly springs to mind, whose lines still sort of reverberate in the back?
There's one during COVID. I'm not sure what it was like in the United States, but at home when people were being told to wash your hands all the time, they were being told to sing Happy Birthday for the length of time that they washed their hands, which is terrible advice. It's like torture. Because then you imagine your friends and cake, instead of sitting around by yourself or whatever was going on, or going to interminable shifts under stress at a hospital. And people who were... Anyway, I decided to recite a Yeats poem that I've known since I was 11. And I hear it, and it's called To a Child Dancing in the Wind. Dance there upon the shore, what need you have to care for wind or water's roar, and tumble out your hair that the salt drops have wet. Being young, you have not known the fool's triumph, nor yet love lost as soon as won, nor the best labourer dead. What need you have to dread the monstrous crying of the wind? We were 11 when we learned that off.
Wow, right.
How magnificent. Nor the best labourer dead. I loved the full stop, the oomph of that, even as a child, And I also loved the modification of tempo. Dance there upon the shore, what need you have to care for wind or water's roar, and tumble out your hair that the salt drops have wet. That line itself also tumbles. So there was just a percussion and a beauty to that. Not too long ago, in the last 10 or 15 years, friends of mine in Belfast, on the odd occasion that they went out, they had a Palestinian friend who would babysit their kids. And Lena, the Palestinian friend, would bring poetry in Arabic from Palestinian poets and recite it to the kids. No, they didn't speak any Arabic, but they used to look forward to her coming so much because they just loved the percussion of it and the sound of it. There's something essential, and I mean that in the sense of the essence of us in the attunement to some kind of meter and rhyme that reminds us perhaps of the primal experience of the heartbeat. Who knows?
Thank you.
That's so interesting to think about the love for the cadence and the rhythm that you talk about. And I wonder if there was someone else in your family who kind of modeled that love for you?
I don't think so. No, there was nobody else who loves poetry as much as me.
Wow.
I'm an anomaly. Of the
Amazing.
six of us, 4 of the siblings are scientists and engineers and biologists. And I have a sister who's a social worker, and we are referred to disparagingly, she and I, as the humanities department of the family, with zero respect from the scientists and engineers.
That's amazing.
We're all musical, though, I should say that. So, yeah, there's a lot of music in the family.
So the rhythm comes out there.
I suppose so, yeah. But it was just in school. I mean, I remember being shocked the first time I met somebody who came from a country where poetry, they might have done it for a couple of weeks, maybe in the autumn semester, for a few years, rather than every week, every year in school. So I'm very grateful for that. That literary focus and the importance, the recognition, I think, that of the strange position and voice that the arts have.
I wonder, Pádraig, does your love for poetry also extend to stories and storytelling that might be not considered so much poetry, but
Yeah, it
but
does.
prose and writing?
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something about the restricted form of poetry that I love, especially, and the line break, the visual of that. If you happen to be looking at a poem as you're considering it, all language can do the work of delight or terror in us, and I find myself thrilled by both. I last year read Tobias Wolff's short story Bullet in the Brain, which is thrilling and shocking and frightening and playful and all of the things. And so, that's just an example of artistry. I love good style in writing. and I love prose or short stories or recited or orated, just told live stories that have attention to style, not as just kind of demonstrating cleverness, but demonstrating something else.
Of course, we're here at Yale Divinity School and Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and so we think often about sort of the biggest questions, and sometimes I kind of want to comfort some of our students and ask them to maybe relax a little bit, because sometimes there's this sort of sprinting after the most intense existential question, but it's inevitable. It's how we're all hardwired. And I heard someone say recently, don't bother with theology, just go read Mary Oliver. And I was really taken by this and really quite, I felt quite compassionate, because it's almost like the difference between eating a meal and reading a cookbook. I mean, I love cookbooks, right? But the cookbook at the end of the day doesn't nourish your body in quite the same ways as a meal, especially a meal with friends. And so I'm wondering about the place of poetry and theology and the relationship to one another. And I think what this person was pointing to is like the primacy of an encounter, having some kind of direct experience. And yet, is there a role also for the form to help hold the formless? I don't know. Do you have a sense of what I'm fumbling to ask here?
Well, certainly, theology and poetry have things to say to each other, perhaps from looking out different windows. And there can be an overlap in thematically. And of course, within theology, you've got some propositional theology and some apophatic theology that really is saying about what we can't say. I love Meister Eckhart's line, none of us can say what God is. I'm very definitely a friend of Meister Eckhart in that way. And so similarly, there's poetry that does similar things. There's poetry too that tries to describe things exactly and tries to exhibit itself as an item of control to say, here's how you should think. It isn't just that. It isn't just some of the corners of theology that try to convince. Some of the corners of poetry do too. I suppose what the hope is when it comes to questions to do with asking, how does a theological intelligence and imagination inform your brain, inform your life, inform your language, inform your relationships? There's going to be a need for a bunch of things on the table. A sacred text with which you can wrestle. And then a whole variety of interpretations and theories of interpretation. And then a whole variety of things that occur because you're in the vicinity of that sacred text. Not to try to extrapolate it or to convince, but just to say, well, this happened near me as a result of this text. And some of those are violent. And that's some of the places where poetry occurs. Kai Miller is a great Jamaican poet, and almost 20 years ago he released a book called There is an Anger That Moves, and he has a sequence of poems in that book of Genesis, Book of Exodus, Book of Leviticus. Those are the titles of the poems. And he just responds to a title like that with something that's happening in his life, or some thought that he has. The one on the Book of Genesis, we made a Poetry Unbound episode about it, is just about the word let, which you find in the English translation of the kind of creative commandment of the God character in Genesis chapter 1. So I love the way that he is not trying to say this is a piece of theology, but he is definitely in the conversation field with these source texts. So, and he's just one of many, but there was something that I felt was transformative when I read that. I read that book when it came out, and it's so much, I loved his book so much that I didn't read any of the next few books. I got them all, I put them on the shelf, but I was so in love with that first book of his that I'd read. He had written others previously, that I couldn't bear to risk the heartache of having a different relationship with his later books. I have subsequently read the other books and enjoyed them very much.
You mentioned Meister Eckhart. I have to invite you to go back there. And some folks who are listening will be really, really familiar, and others less so. I wonder if you can share just a little bit about what in Meister Eckhart's writing and his theological vision captivates you, over a half a millennium later.
Yeah. So Meister Eckhart, he died probably in around 1327, 1328. I think he was in his 60s when he died. He was a Dominican priest and a Meister, so he had been to Paris to study at the institute there. So he was an academic. He was renowned within this. This is while he was alive, especially in the later part of his life. It's when the papacy was in exile in Avignon. And so there were big fights between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, as to whether the soul is composed of the mind, will, and emotions, or different orders of those things. Oh, my God. He had trained formally in scholastic philosophy, and so in many ways his Latin writing would be considered to be of the secular project of scholastic engagement, which really is one of the things the scholastics were doing, trying to think, how can you apply reason to the world, apply reason to the question of the existence of God. So Meister Eckhart's Latin writings do say things like, and 15thly, because that's what the scholastics did. I read the Latin writings, the translations of them, and kind of as preparation for reading his sermons, which he delivered in the vernacular. A number of them, it seems, to communities of women religious, convents, nuns. And those, he takes one text and kind of free associates with it in a delightful medieval way that is of its time and also timeless. So he says things like, the famous one is, the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. What on earth does that mean? Nobody knows. He says things like, none of us can say what God is. He also says we can say some of the things that God is not, which I think that's an interesting point. He says he has a deep interest in time. The opening words of what's considered his opening sermon, or his first sermon in terms of the earliest one that we have, is here in time, which gives an indication that he recognizes that we live in time. But much later on, he says we are the hinge point of time and eternity, that our lives unfold in time, but our soul is linked to eternity, and that the task of prayer is to somehow find an echo between one and the other. I think in many ways, were he to have been born much later, he might have gone into theoretical physics of time rather than theology, because I think there's something of him that's fascinating. At one point, and this feels like a little postcard from the 1320s, at one point he is giving a sermon and he interrupts himself almost, although he's scripted this, where he is talking about love. And he says, for instance, he must have been speaking to nuns. He said, one of you yesterday, I noticed as I came in to say Mass, had placed fresh flowers in the grave of your sister who had recently died. And he just leaves that there. And, for all the mystical things that he says, it's his absolute groundedness in the here and now, to notice, to be present, that interests me so much. His defense when he was accused of heresy, his defense shows a pristine intellect that did not suffer fools lightly. I kind of hate when he's called a mystic, even though, of course, he is within the mystical tradition. But the implication is that he wandered around the place saying, hello, my name is Meister Eckhart, I'm a mystic. When, he was a teacher, he was an intellectual. He was vicious if you went after him for political reasons and justified those using shallow thinking. And I admire him so much.
Oh, thank you. And he was also an administrator. I think he was in charge of hundreds of Dominican houses. And in our time, yes, we tend to think of those tasks as totally separate. Our spiritual folks, our mystics are in one place, our theologians do something else, and then, God forbid, our administrators are doing something wholly different. I love that integration. So thank you for celebrating this wonderful soul.
There's a great tradition in Ireland of the civil servant poet. The Welsh tradition has all of these priest poets, but in Ireland there was loads of the Irish language poets were lifelong civil servants. It's difficult to fire a civil servant in Ireland, so maybe they had a kind of the life of Larry, able to work a few hours a day and then sit back and write poetry, ask Gaelga. So.
I wondered if we could go back to, you dropped the word prayer. And I've also heard, folks describe poetry as a form of prayer or as praying, as you write. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your prayer life and how do you pray, or do you see a connection between the writing you're doing and prayer?
Well, to think about the word prayer, I think about the source of it in English anyway, prier from French, to ask, which is therefore linked to desire. And what does it mean to be a person who's in relationship with your own desire? And what does it mean to be a species who have a complicated relationship with desire. And so therefore, for me, the question about prayer is a psychoanalytical one, is a living one, is an artistic one, is an ethical one. I think we're all caught up in desire and what we do with it, how we communicate with it, how we repress it, how we moderate it, how we exploit it, what we do to other people to get what we say we desire, what happens when we get what we say we desire. Years ago, I needed to buy a new bag for travel. It was during COVID. I had to rush home to Ireland when Ireland was shutting down, and my bag was damaged beyond repair. So I thought, I should get another one. And there's a company that makes these nice recycled bags, and I thought, sure, I'll keep an eye on that. And whenever the right colour comes up, I'll buy it. Nobody was going anywhere. Anyway, a number of months went by, and I check whenever I'd remember, maybe once every 10 days or so. And after a number of months, a bag that I liked came up, and I bought it and put it in the back of the wardrobe because nobody was going anywhere. But a week later, even though I was very satisfied with the bag that I'd got, I was back on the website looking, and I missed my looking. I missed my desire. And there was something sweet about that. And it's small and mild, but it shows, I think, that the relationship to want is not necessarily in the direction of satisfaction. That the relationship to want is sometimes to continue to be in the position of want and to continue to circumnavigate absence. And that's relevant to me when it comes to the question of prayer, because it is given to me to pray, but it is not given to me to believe. I have been in and out of religious life my whole life. I've been kind of burdened by a religious culture that was pretty awful to gay people, and also in its formal voice lacked courage to speak about British occupation and sectarianism regarding partition. And I don't know, it's just not given to me to be too good a believer, but it is given to me to be in the nothingness of prayer and to think about what happens there.
That is such a beautiful way to think about that. It really, really is. I wonder if you find that poetry helps keep that hope and desire alive, and if it can be really useful in that way because it keeps us sort of simmering in the things that we desire?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think the human condition keeps us simmering in the things we desire. And I wouldn't use the word hope. I would just... no, I'm not sure what hope means, but I would talk about desire and the strange space that sometimes is contemplative, sometimes is compulsive, that we're caught in when it comes to the relationship with desire. Look at politics, look at, so much of politics is about exploiting what it is that people think you say you want and doing really what you want, which is to win. Somebody might say, well, let's go for a win-win strategy, in a bipartisan way. Who'd want that if your main desire is to win, or if your main desire is to see the other shamed? Why on earth would you go for something that's going to see the other dignified if your desire is to see the other shamed? And that too is in the realm of prayer. And if a spiritual tradition's teaching about prayer do not force you to think about the seriously damaging way that we relate to our own desire, well then I don't think that spiritual tradition is worth the paper it's written on. I have a poem actually. I have 16 poems in the latest book of poetry, all of which have the same title, Do You Believe in God?
Yes.
So here's one of them. And this is a sonnet, or it was a 14-line poem at any rate. And the first 13 lines all end with the same word, which is you, the lyric address, the great emptiness to which we address. Do you believe in God? I turn to you not because I trust you or believe in you, but because I need a direction for my need. You, the space between me and death. You, the hum at the heart of an atom. You, nothing. You, my favorite emptiness. You, what I turned away from and will turn to. You, my ache made manifest in address. You, silent you, what my friends saw as they died. You, contain what's not containable. You, shape of my desire.
Oh, thank you. what's coming up for me as someone who has for a long time stood at the intersection of Zen practice and Christian spirituality is this push and pull over desire. And some of our Buddhist friends will talk about the spiritual path in Zen as a kind of extinguishing of desire, right? Mm-hmm. Nirvana meaning extinguishing, literally, right? And then in the Christian tradition, a desire is a classic Augustine, right? Desire has been planted within us so that we long for the one that can ultimately fulfill our desires usually at some future point, right? And so I wonder, how do you stand amid that push and pull? As you said, some of the things we desire are absolutely horrific and terrible. Other things we desire are sweet, and there's maybe most of life is somewhere being tossed around in between. How do you hold all that?
I don't know. Yeah. How do we not explode?
How do we not explode?
So, yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I do, of course. You've got some practices, or you've got friends, or you've got tradition, or you've got people who'll tell you, you're being a terrible human being, hopefully, or you've got some text that you turn to as well that tries to moderate you. Because even in desiring something good or something fairly good, we can do terrible things for that purpose, So it is a very complex thing that we try to outwork, and in that way, the question about spirituality and desire is an entirely secular one, because it plays itself out in the here and now with people who are around us, whether or not you are co-religionists with each other. I really like Ignatius of Loyola, and he encouraged his followers to practice this thing called active detachment, which, of course, he wasn't unique in proposing that. You find this called different things in many traditions around the world. It kind of picks up on certain things that the Stoics also proposed, which was to consider the day that's about to come, maybe the night before in your examen, and to think, what am I thinking is going to be atrocious, and how can I separate myself from some of this fixation on that might be coming up. But also, what am I thinking that's going to be absolutely perfect, and how can I separate myself from the fixation of that? Because it might be that you're surprised by what it is you thought you'd dread, and deeply disappointed by what it is you thought that you would love. And he says that both dread and disappointment can lead us away from the principle and foundation, which that is really a way of asking, who is it that you feel called to be in the world, with your friends, with your people, with yourself, and what's going to take you away from that? So it isn't an emotionless life he lives. Really, it's about a life of deep, indigenous integrity to what it is you feel most called to, and don't let anything steal that away.
You find, over your years of life that you've been called to be something different over time? I mean, was the things that were knocking on your door, the desires you might have had, the longings, the wisdom you might have acquired when you were 25, and now you just admitted to being 50. Yay!
Yeah. Well, in October, I'll be 50.
In October, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, has that call changed for you over time?
Well, I don't know that it's about whether it's changed. I mean, like when I was 19, 20, I really thought I was being called to the priesthood, the Catholic priesthood. And so for a number of years, I did pursue that, visiting different monasteries or orders of priests and thinking about this group or that group. And I started a pontifical degree in theology, and I completed it too. But that I did that as part of a kind of a preemptive way of having talked to a bishop in the diocese in which Belfast is in, saying, look, I'm interested in kind of peace and ecumenical work, and I find myself with this work and this relationship and this mediation work. Is there a possibility for finding a way to fold that in? So he said, well, you're doing the pontifical degree. When that's finished, move into the seminary, and then we'll take things from there. But during that time of the degree, Pope John Paul II died and Benedict became Pope. And I had read, it was a very, very conservative degree that I was doing, and I had read much of what John Paul II had written, and much also about what Benedict had written. And Benedict had made a kind of an edict when he was in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith to say that people with the homosexual tendency that lasts longer than 2 years would not be admissible to the priesthood because of a psychological incapacity to maintain healthy relationships, either with men or with women, which is absolute idiocy. I mean, that is the Catholic Church proposes that it is a church that that follows science. And that is a scientific statement to make that. If you're going to say a psychological incapacity, you need to be able to go, well, verify that shit. And you can't, because it's an ideological statement that is designed to justify something that was pre-decided. And so, it's moral ideology rather than moral philosophy. It's not even that moral. And so as soon as that happened, I knew that something was up, unless I was willing to be in a closet. And anyway, the bishop came and said, the plan isn't going to work. And I called him a coward. And he said, yeah, you're right, but I'll lose. This isn't a battle worth fighting. So he brought me a bottle of wine. It's kind of a consolation statement. So in many ways, like many people, it isn't that my vocation changed. It's that you're caught up in a system that hates you. And you're caught up in a system that denies you something because of the system's chosen misunderstanding about who it is they think you are. And what do you do with that kind of exile, that kind of rage, that kind of pain, that kind of yearning? Certainly for me, I turned it into poetry. I was writing poetry all along, but I turned it into poems specifically, I suppose. That's all I could do, or explode.
I wonder, as you were reckoning with the moral failure of the Catholic Church at that time, a faith community that you were, I presume, really invested enough to get a big long degree and contemplate, a priesthood. Did that shift your relationship with the divine in any way? I know for many, many folks, when they encounter in their churches, in their faith communities, just utter hatred, that this also has a way of throwing a real hand grenade into their relationship with the divine. The most intimate relationship is impacted by the community relationship that's also fractured. Did any of that unfold for you?
Oh, yes, but I think that was, I think that was going to happen anyway, though. I think any tradition that tries to look at the question of God will ultimately look at the question of nothing and absence. And so that was just part of spiritual development. So I'm grateful for whatever complicated circumstances kind of might have pushed me a step or two along the way, but those steps were going to happen anyway, as they happen in all of our lives, as you face the unexplainable, as you face the inadequacy of the language that you thought had previously been adequate.
Well, I'm appreciating you normalizing it, because so many students or, as a spiritual director, folks will come to me as if that experience of nothingness, or like when the bottom falls out, that the ground I thought I was standing on has disappeared. Often the first response is, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with me, right? And so thank you for sort of describing the inevitability of it. And I wonder if you could flesh that out, how that experience was for you, or how you counsel and support people who come to you with, gosh, it all just disappeared. Everything that I trusted as part of the architecture of reality just turned to sand.
I mean, one of the great benefits of being brought up Irish Catholic was that, the lives of the saints were just expected to be discussed in school, and so throughout my whole life, I remember kind of at the age of 8, hearing about, the terrible desolation of St. Teresa, the little flower went through. Or, this phrase, dark night of the soul, and it's poetically appealing, even if you don't comprehend what John of the Cross meant by it, as a child, I mean. And so I encountered Protestants at the age of 11, and my life really has been shaped by evangelicals, and particularly a kind of an American charismatic evangelicalism as well. I worked with a group called Youth with a Mission for a long time in my 20s, and so I mistakenly thought that they were quite Catholic when I joined them in Dublin, because the Dublin outfit was very Catholic. So this is before the internet. And so But I was shocked when I encountered people for whom the experience of doubt seemed to be something of devastation, and the experience of change, and the experience that you have something to learn, and the experience that, of course, you're going to talk differently about the idea of God, and God is present and God is absent at 50 than you are at 15. And if somebody at 50 is using the same terminology that they were using at 15, part of me, I'm curious as to how that works, because the world has a terrible way of convincing us about its chaos. And if the language used in spirituality is in denial of that, well, then it occurs to me that the crisis and distress that we live through just by being human is going to be deepened by putting yourself in a situation where you're desperately trying to cling on to something that plainly isn't true in terms of certitude or predictability.
You talked earlier about the desires and how people's desires conflict, and you also talked about reconciliation work. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about Corrymeela, the community, and what that was like and how that affected your writing.
Yeah, how it affected my writing, okay. I'll probably forget that part, so you might need to remind me of that bit. So Corrymeela is an ecumenical community set up in 1965. To kind of give a bit of historical context, there was all of these ecumenical communities set up all around Europe after the Second World War. These days we'd probably call them centres for public theology. So they weren't monasteries, they weren't necessarily places where people were living together, but they were places where people were saying, how could we have been involved in silence or certain amounts of silence as a result of that? There's a whole load of them in Germany. So there was this whole outbreak in the 50s of these ecumenical communities. The Iona community had been a kind of a precursor to that. I think that started in the 30s or the 40s. Anyway, Ray Davey had been a Presbyterian minister and a volunteer padre with the YMCA in the Second World War, and he was captured and incarcerated in a prisoner of war camp outside Dresden. And he was released from that prisoner of war camp because of the Allied bombing of Dresden. So his freedom came with what we now understand, and what he understood at the time too, to be a war crime, the annihilation of entire population of people, enormous amounts of people in Dresden. So he came back to Belfast, and Belfast hadn't been that long, the north of Ireland hadn't been that long partitioned. That had happened in 1921. Of course, there was nothing democratic about that partitioning. It was creating a Protestant state for a Protestant people, and entire gerrymandering. We know a lot about that in Ireland over the last 100 years, and we have active policies to go against it rather than active policies to facilitate it. And so, the dogs on the street could see that the society in the north of Ireland was moving towards the increasing of conflict. And so he worked as a chaplain from 1945 to 1965. And then in 1965, the Evangelical Holiday Fellowship had a house on the very north coast of Ireland. They sound like a barrel of laughs, don't they? They had a house on the north of Ireland on a piece of land for sale. And he contacted students who'd been through the chaplaincy in Queen's and Belfast over the previous 20 years and said, I think things are bad and they're going to get worse. So we need places for people to meet, to have very serious arguments about peace. And so I think they'd raised most of the money within a month or so, and they purchased this. And the field on which this house was built was called Corrymeela. In Ireland, all the fields they're called townlands, or it might be a cluster of fields, and so they just looked at the name of the townland and called it the Corrymeela community. So it's entirely based on that. It's right on the north coast, 14 miles across to Scotland. And so since 1965, the Corrymeela community has been a place where people come for a day or a week or weekends or a course of programming over the course of one night a week over years or whatever, to look at questions about what does it mean to share a society together. And there is an affiliation to Christianity within it, but right from the word go, Corrymeela was a place where loads of people who were like, sure, I'm affiliated with this denomination or that denomination, but they weren't that concerned. They happily put up if you want to start something with a little prayer at the start, lovely, but they're much more interested in the here and now rather than in the hereafter. So Corrymeela is not a very holy community, and there is a live-in volunteer program there, but like the Corrymeela community is dispersed people going about their ordinary life who have a commitment really to being a member of this ecumenical community. So then I got involved in 2002, 2003, and then from 2014 to 2019 I was the leader of Corrymeela, and I'm still a member. So, and how it changed my writing, I should remember it now.
Thank you.
I don't know. I'm probably the last person to say how it changed my writing. I was poet in residence for lots of groups where I was kind of writing occasional poems for them on the occasion of their meeting, people who met across terrible circumstances and wanted to figure out how do we talk about what we've been through, or how do we meet people who represent a community that might tell what we suffered in a different way, or how do we meet people who represent the force that took up arms against us, you know. Nobody's forced into that, but lots of people had curiosity, so Corrymeela was involved in lots of that kind of encounter work, and of course to try to put language around that is important, and to look at ways within which language fails, or language points, or language contains. I wrote a short poem called "The Pedagogy of Conflict." After one, there was people from all across Ireland, north and south, of a whole variety of political opinions, and most people had been involved or affected by murder, and there was a whole bunch of Palestinians and Israelis in the room too, and we were in the room for 3 days trying to talk about, can we find any language that works? And somebody used the word murder to talk about what they'd done, and somebody else said, shut up, you didn't murder, you were just following orders. And somebody said, well, I only ever killed legitimate targets. And somebody else said, well, that must have made me a legitimate target when your group shot me. And so we were talking about language, which I found so interesting. So I can recite one of those poems. It's very short.
Please.
It's called The Pedagogy of Conflict. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days I've been counting lives, so I count 1 life. 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life. Legitimate target has 16 letters and 1 long, abominable space between 2 dehumanizing words. So poems like that were written in the space of emptiness created by people who were using language to say probably the last thing they wanted to say about the circumstances that they never wanted to live through. And there was courage in people from all political approaches to what we were doing, because they'd come to the room. And I suppose part of the aim of trying to think, how can I listen into the emptiness that's created together, is to allow something of art to pick up on something of language and see what happens.
Can you talk a little bit about what your writing process looks like, or is there a single process that you can point to, or is it different every day, or so how does a poem how do you catch a poem out of the air, or talk about the development and your creative process, if you would?
Well, it's different at different times of the year. If I've got a deadline, it's different. I mean, if I had a deadline of today for a poem, I wouldn't start writing that poem today. Yeah. I've been trying to listen into things for months in advance. But I read poetry every day. I always wake early, so I read poetry in the mornings, and that typically makes a bit of space for things. I try to edit poems, so you're always kind of working away on a few poems. And I think by making the space for it, well, then you're likely to be able to listen into when something of a poem comes to you, some line comes. And often those things don't come during that time. They come much later on, But I think having the practice means that you are practiced in listening for when it comes. And so they're two very different things, but I think they can support each other. And of course, then there are times that go through months, really, where you think, I've written the last poem I'm ever going to write, but I still keep on reading it, But I know enough to know that when that happens, to go, well, I'm just part of a great community of people. I can look over my shoulder and find probably every poet ever going, hi, welcome. Yeah, we're all part of this. Yeah, us too. And somebody might go, yeah, I didn't write a poem for 10 years and then I wrote the book that I'm known for, or whatever. And so I'm not distressed by the ways within which the relationship with the production of something comes and goes. It's not a strategic plan. It's not a pathway to being known. It's something that corresponds to the phenomenology of art in a sense for me, rather than something that's a commodity where I feel a pressure that I have to release something.
I was going to take us a little bit down a darker hole, but I wanted to ask, what does distress you right now, Pádraig? What is keeping you awake? And also, you were speaking of the Coromila community and that being kind of I guess sometimes we call them third spaces where people can come together from different backgrounds and have those hard conversations. So I guess double-sided question, what's distressing you? And are there those sorts of spaces? Are you seeing those spaces now that you've been in the States for a while? Or is there anything that's comparable to what was going on and what is going on at Coromila?
Oh, I'm sure there is. Yeah. What distresses me? There are so many things that distress me. That of all of the wars going on at the moment, I only know the ones that I see in the headlines that I look at. I try to make sure to read across different news sources to make sure that which is distressing people elsewhere is not just going away because it's not on the news feed I have. How can I not be distressed of what's happening in Gaza? One of the poems we learned, I think we were 11 in school, was a poem in Irish about Palestinian children. So what's that, 40 years ago. And so the Irish cause and the Palestinian cause have been linked, sometimes problematically, throughout my whole life. And so like the question of the complicated overlap of religion and land and power and partition, and the question about creating states where people are or aren't free to live as citizens, those are things that have shaped my life and shaped my politics in terms of who I vote for, and shaped my politics in terms of how I think about what it is that's possible and necessary for democracy. And then, being shaped similarly by an absolute love of Midrash and an entire indebtedness to Jewish religion. There's been a lot of exchange between Ireland, the north of Ireland, and people from Israel and Palestine. South Africans, people from Cyprus, people from both sides of the partition, although particularly the southern side in the Korean peninsula. I've been part of all kinds of exchanges of people from places, and seeing ways within which there can be an idea that being as virulent as possible in public is going to contribute to the cause of justice causes me some distress, because I don't think it's useful. It's totally understandable. I'm there. I'm outraged too. But I'm a pragmatist. What can we do that's going to help? And I don't know the answer to that. So, protest is definitely one of them. But awareness raising, the awful inevitability when we think of some of the conflicts is that when, please God, somebody emerges who can operate as a leader of some kind of negotiation towards some kind of increase of safety, is that lots of people will cancel them because they don't think that person has the right politics either, And so it's the loneliest thing in the world is to be a leader in those kinds of situations, the loneliest thing. And I wish whomever that is, I wish them safety and their family, as well as the intelligence and imagination to be able to get something that's better than what we have now. So all of those things distress me. The easy way, it seems to me, of public participation in absolute sectarianism, of the us and them dynamics that we know and have learnt century after century after century, and our sacred texts and literatures are filled with ways within which that absolutely denies and diminishes human dignity and the imagination. Like, why on earth do we have Romeo and Juliet, for God's sake, if not for serious consideration about what it is that happens in communities of people where they are reared to hate each other? And that's just in the absolutely local environment of the city in which that's set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I guess the other half of that question about Coromila, and also where are those spaces, or where are those actions happening that maybe you see where we are having hard conversations about language, about how we characterize what's in front of us, all of that?
I mean, I'm a foreigner living in the United States, so my kind of disposition is to see the ways in which this stuff is already happening. Of course, there's higher level ways and more public ways that people would want it. But my guess is in many situations, there's many people who would be categorized as being part of the problem, who themselves are possibly doing quite courageous things when it comes to the people with whom they're in relationship, in their local communities or in their farming communities or in wherever they're working. So I suppose I want to recognize that and applaud it. It's too easy to be a foreigner thinking, well, here's who the problem is. What do I know? I might have some ideas, but even those ideas would need to be shaped. You know, I see anything that's willing to fact check itself as a really good thing. And anything that's willing to say, we got that wrong, is a really good thing. And to say, if you write to them, that they are publicly obliged to have to pay attention to your critique and to ask themselves, were they wrong? That's a good idea. You know, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good idea. Because that's what we're looking for in integrity. I think of some media spaces that have shaped their public witness around that. It's a pretty fine thing to do. There's so many in the States. You know, I know so many civic groups that are doing the work. You know, centers for public conversation and centers for dialogue and centers that are trying to say we vote differently, but we all do care about rainfall for crop growth, and ways within which people are trying desperately to say, not let's find a neutral, flaccid middle around which, you know, we don't talk about anything, but to find a way within which serious tension is maintained for the purpose of saying, well, here is an agreeable outcome that might be worthwhile trying to work on together. I play the guitar, and so, you know, musical instruments that are string-based have a lot to teach us, of course, about what happens when things are held in tension and where you can tune the tension for the purpose of a chord.
Oh, thank you. I'd love us maybe to end with a poem, but before we invite you to read something for us, we have a custom of ending with 5 questions we sometimes called Holy Cow, because we get to learn something astonishing about you that we might not otherwise know. And of course, our mascot here at Berkeley at Yale is the winged ox.
Okay, the first question is, what do people most misunderstand about you or about what you do?
I don't really know. I could say rage. You know, there's so much rage behind my work, and yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Oh, I get a good one. What is your go-to comfort food?
I love tinned tuna with corn and peas.
Like all to get like mixed up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that an Irish thing?
No, I don't know what it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wanna
It's
try
probably
that.
I've got 5 minutes to make lunch thing.
Oh my gosh.
Perfect.
I want to try that.
So good. Yeah.
I won't be allowed, though, because we're not allowed to have canned tuna in the house, because when my wife was pregnant, I opened up a can of tuna. From the other end of the house, she smelled it, and I was universally
And
banished.
now it's never
There's
allowed.
never allowed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's how I feel about tuna too.
Oh.
Sorry, but I'm happy for you.
Honestly,
I'm so happy for you.
You just lied to me. I could see your face. You judged me. There's no happiness. There's no acceptance.
Desire. There should be reconciliation.
look at
This is a judgment-heavy podcast.
look at how red Whitney has suddenly turned.
Blushing on the radio.
What's a bad habit you're willing to share?
Grey's Anatomy.
Oh, yeah. You and many of us.
I mean, it's kind of a good bad habit, but like certainly when I was mediating some conflicts, you know, that were going on for a long time, come home exhausted, and I'd watch an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and you know, over the course of 40 minutes, you know, a couple would get divorced, and then the others would hook up with somebody. Somebody would decide, I want a child, and then they'd adopt one. Somebody else would operate on somebody who had a bomb inside of them. And meanwhile, the involved love lives of people would sort themselves out by the end of the episode. It was so satisfactory.
I love it.
That's perfect. What life lesson are you still learning? You can answer that real fast, I'm sure.
Rhythm. How to have rhythms that are sustaining. Yeah.
And what keeps you going when your inner critic is telling you to give up?
Probably that I'm giving far more attention to myself than anybody has ever or will ever give to me. that we're all focused on ourselves. And, I don't mean that in a terrible way, but just, that I'm probably experiencing the shame of whatever it is my inner critic is saying on a very intense level. And strangely, other people are much more focused on something else, not me.
Well, Pádraig, thank you for taking time to be here with us at Yale, to join us for a conversation as we begin our semester. Thank you for all the work you're doing, and thank you for being in the world and your voice. It means so much to us. I wonder if you'd leave us with some of your voice, either in English or in Irish or whatever you feel moved to share.
Yeah, I've got one here. This is a poem. It's the final poem in Kitchen Hymns, called Untitled Misty. It finishes with the word who, and I chose that partly because of the Nietzschean reference to the question of who that Nietzsche asks, but much, much more so because I wanted the sound of an animal to be the end of this book. So there was an owl living in the backyard where I was writing this book. Untitled Misty. I bless myself in the name of the deer and ox, the heron and the hare, evangelists of land and wood and air, the fox as well, that red predator of chickens, prey of cars, and the salmon and the trout sleeping in the reeds. When the wren wakes, I'll ask her blessing, and if she comes out, she'll bring it. The squirrel buries where she thinks no one else can see. I bless myself in her secrecy. There's a field mouse I've seen scampering at dusk, picking up the seeds dropped by the finches and the tits along the way. Some nest of frenzy waits her kindness and her pluck. I go in the name of all of them, their chaos and their industry, their replacements, their population, their forgettable ways, their untamed natures, their ignorance of why or how or who.
Thank you for joining us today on the Leader's Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We hope you found the episode expansive and nourishing. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. Your support helps us to continue bringing you sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who are dedicated to transforming our world. For more information about our guests and to catch up on past episodes, visit our website at berkeleydivinity.yale.edu. Follow the show on Instagram at theleadersway.podcast to stay updated on future episodes and events. Until next time, I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, walking with you as you lead with courage, wisdom, and compassion.